Hello everybody and welcome to Brewmasters, where we interview tabletop game designers to get their insights on the craft. Today we're talking to Izzy. You might know him from the Discord and many things, or more likely as a contributor to Amarune's Almanac, author of celebrated classes like the Disciple, the Incarnate and the Occultist, and of course the man behind Heroes of Dwarfhome and so much more. Before we talk to him though, I'm happy to announce that this show is now available as a podcast. Turns out that was just as easy to set up as I hoped it would be. You can find the show Brewmasters now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and a ton more places. Everywhere you might normally find podcasts, with three exceptions. I'm just waiting on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and Pandora to finish setting things up. But in the meanwhile, there's a link to the podcast site in the description, and that'll work on mobile or desktop, and you can go to your favourite service from there or listen direct. The podcast episode should go live on either the same day as the videos or very shortly after. We have a full backlog of the episodes on there up to date with new intros and outros recorded. This episode should be the first new one up on there today, same time as this video goes live. Of course, videos will still be going up here on YouTube, and future projects will involve actual video footage, so stay tuned for that. And remember to like the video if you enjoy what we're talking about on here, and of course subscribe. We've been very mean to that bell icon the past few months, so please this week cast a healing word on it to get notifications when new videos come out. And lastly, just to remind you that this episode we did end up talking for about 4.5 hours, so it's going to be split up into two halves. This is going to be the first half, and then the next half will go up next Sunday. With that out of the way, let's go over to the interview. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Izzy. It's great to have you here.
Nice to be here.
So we're just going to start off by getting to know you a little bit. So I'd like to ask this first question to all of the guests so far. So what was your first tabletop role-playing game experience?
It was D&D 3.5. I was playing this half-elf ranger named Remy. She had a pet pseudo-dragon, and I was basically entirely useless because I was a 3.5 ranger. I didn't know what I was doing. My animal companion was essentially just like a pet. It didn't really do anything. It was a pseudo-dragon. They're not especially useful. It was in a desert campaign, and I was very definitively a forest ranger.
Oh no.
Yeah, it was a rough one. I basically was the group's deadpan character. I was the straight man. I wanted to say that's her personality, but it was like half her personality and half I made her that way because I didn't know what I was doing roleplay wise. So really, ultimately not super interesting a character. It was, I believe her backstory was, her parents were essentially killed by a group of raiders. She was essentially part of like a familial ranger conclave, and her parents were killed by this group that came in. And that's you think, oh, it's like a sort of like an edgy classic backstory, but my character just literally didn't care. Remy just did not care that her parents were murdered. When she was asked about it, she was just like, it's the nature of things.
Oof.
So she didn't, it's like, survival of the fittest. All right, well, my character has no motivation. Let's go. She literally was just kinda, yeah. She was almost just non-emotional. It was extraordinarily weird. But again, it got me into the game, so that's more than I could ask out of her.
Damn. I grew up in 3.5 myself. How are you finding the transition to 5th edition?
Better in almost every way. I do like modularity. I like modularity a lot. What I have learned in 5th edition is that where you get modularity matters a ton. So like everyone getting a bunch of tiny feats. Like let's put it this way. In 3.5, there was a feat that you could, it was dodge. You could declare an enemy and you have +1 AC against that enemy. I think, let's say 70% of the martial characters I've been in that's been in my party in 3.5 had that feat because it was a prerequisite to like a prestige class or a different feat, and like maybe half of them actually used it because giving the mental bandwidth to something so small, and in 3.5 +1 AC was pretty small.
Mm.
It just didn't matter. So, well, the part where you miss it the most in 5th edition is definitely like when you're playing a martial character, you have less choice about how you express that martial character. You can't over specialize into a thing really. You can pick your subclass and you can pick some feats, but the feats in 5th edition don't get nearly as creative for the martial characters as the feats in 3.5. There's no chain whip master, though that's not technically a feat, but I'm talking like trip attacks.
Yeah.
There's no you can't trip attack with whips. Though not that a 3.5 character would necessarily use whips, and this is where we come back around to 5th edition making everything a lot more a lot better in terms of actually being able to use the options in the game, right? But like you could do crazy things with exotic weapons and specific combinations that gave your character a unique flair in how they fought. In 5th edition, that's all flavor, which that's not necessarily a bad thing, but for me, it does leave a certain something to be desired. And that's part of why I like homebrewing so much. Because it lets you get a little more granular with your concepts, right?
Absolutely.
So reflavoring is super powerful as a concept, and that's a lot of something that 5th edition thrives on. But every player has a different amount they're actually willing to reflavor. And my tolerance for it is probably lower than the average person's. It's just like in terms of 5th edition, it introduced more clarity to your options. And I think like for my personal enjoyment, just like a few more significant options and it'd be like perfect for me. It's just, but right now is pretty damn close.
Yeah, it feels like it's right on the cusp of something because like I mean the simplification has been good and bad in different areas, like the more overcomplicated classes like the old wizard and sorcerer, those have worked out really well for 5th edition, I think. But
oh dude, I didn't even touch 3.5 wizard.
It was so much more intricate.
I read it like 4 times before I understood it, and then I saw that's stupid and didn't touch it.
Because yeah, didn't you have to prepare like the same spell individual times?
Correct. Yeah, it was Vancian casting, so you would have to prepare each individual instance of a spell you wanted to cast. If you had 4 4th level spell slots, you needed to prepare 4 4th level spells, or 4 4th level castings rather. So you could say 2 dimension doors, 1 blight, 1 summon greater demon or whatever.
Exactly.
You couldn't just do dimension door, greater demon, and so on. You were limited to the amount of castings ahead of time. Though you could leave spells unprepared and then prepare them later in the day. That's part of the thing that people tend to forget on that front. And actually, I feel like 5th edition originally had that, because if you read in the spellcasting blocks, they tell you how much time it takes for you to prepare any given spell. I believe it's 1 minute per spell level.
Oh yeah, true.
So I do believe 5th edition was actually supposed to have that at one point. They just never removed that from the block. Because like in most games, that's useless information.
Yeah.
Unless you allow the preparation of spells outside of combat or outside of long rest. And I've experimented with allowing that sort of a thing in my game, leaving spells unprepared, but I just found my players don't do it.
Yeah, it's like carrying capacity. Like I've never played a 5e game that cared about how many like arrows you're carrying.
I'm in Tomb of Annihilation, and we care about it there. But also, we have a Firbolg Death Cleric, and so he just carries everything, and we don't care. So, like, he's tracking it because it's fun for his character to carry, like, 500 pounds of whatever. Like, he literally just carries an entire canoe.
Jesus.
I think it's like 100 pounds, and he just walks along with it because his character doesn't care. He can do it. But like outside of that, most games we just tend to ignore carrying capacity because it's less fun to work with.
Yeah, exactly.
And to that end is actually where 5th edition can learn from other systems. Like I know Starfinder and I think Pathfinder 2e started using a bulk system for inventory that makes tracking it a lot more fun, which I can appreciate a lot.
I've heard of I think it was from Matt Colville, the is it the inventory dice or something? Like you have like a die that increases in size based on how much general cash the group has, and then you can reduce its number based on when you want to expend and gain resources.
Like that for travel. The thing that always stopped me from doing that for travel, doing something like that for travel and resource management, is the idea of stocking up. Like, player goes up and buys 50 rations. What should your supply die be when they say something like that? It's like, all right, well, I buy 100 rations. What do you do? There's not really recourse for that because you can't be like, all right, you can't just perpetually increase the die. After a certain point, it becomes meaningless to track. Obviously, there are other resources you need, like water and ropes, things like that, and that's where the abstraction gets kind of cool. Where it's like, okay, if the player doesn't have this, you can roll to see if they had it. But if you're doing it like that, then the supply die doesn't matter because you're still having to track the amount of food and water.
Well, my understanding is that you would like just assume they had the capability to have purchased that, and if it was a large enough expenditure of the level of the dice, then you would decrease the number or something like that. But then it takes the fun out of like, oh, well, you might not have something. You generally assume to be able to have had it.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. Like that sort of system doesn't take into account over preparedness. Because I've had lots of players come in like in Tomb of Annihilation. The party was like, all right, this is 2 weeks. This is a 2-week trip we're about to do. Let's buy 50 rations. You reasonably are not going to run out of rations. Unless something steals it, and that's a fun encounter. Someone's trying to steal your food, you got to stop them.
Yeah.
But outside of that, what is that die doing in terms of food now? Because there's no realistic way that should be, that rolling low on that die should be able to get you anywhere, or should affect you, because you've explicitly stated the amount of rations you have.
Oh, so yeah, I don't think you would if you were using that kind of a resource system.
Right, you wouldn't. But then it's one of those things that like the verisimilitude comes into question. It's like, I buy 50 rations. All right, you can't say that. Why? There's not really an in-game explanation for it. It's we don't have rules for that. And that feels kind of bad. It feels kind of cheap to me. Because suddenly you've introduced this blockage between you and the game. And when it comes to design for me, removing that as much as possible is my goal when it comes to designing something. That's actually where a lot of my class design comes from. Acknowledging the separation and finding ways to minimize it as much as possible.
Yeah, because every group is going to be drawing their fun from different parts of the game, right? Like, having come from 3.5, I think I would assume that me and you have a similar interest in slightly more crunchier approaches to things, where you can actually feel like things are being represented rather than being comfortable with them being abstracted.
Yes and no. Definitely, I'm probably, I am reasonably able to play crunchy systems and enjoy myself. That's not necessarily like my preferred method. Like I'm working on a crafting system that uses abstracted dice like that.
Hmm.
The problem comes in where the abstraction gets in the way of verisimilitude. The abstraction should work towards it, not try to essentially the abstraction should work for verisimilitude, not against it. I think that's when abstraction as a game design mechanic is at its strongest. Obviously, you lose some degree of verisimilitude no matter what you do when you abstract, but how well it plays into representing the thing that you're doing
Hmm.
matters a lot for at least my enjoyment of the mechanic. And my feedback so far has seems to indicate that I'm definitely not alone in this sort of thinking, though there are definitely people that push back on it.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have people who are opposed to anything, even if it's just for the sake of opposing it. But could you give say, an example of the abstraction helping or hindering the verisimilitude?
So, normally speaking, in D&D, crafting has been represented with like, at the end of a day or at the end of a week, roll a skill check and make X amount of money's worth of progress towards the thing.
Yeah.
That I don't feel is very helpful. It's not really representative of how people craft. It's not really. It's essentially a loading bar that uses the cost of the object. It's not really working. Like it works towards the verisimilitude in one sense, right? In that it's helping out it's envisioning the progress of the item. Some days you do more work, some days you do less work.
Yeah.
The problem comes in where you're introducing that crunch and a little bit of that abstraction, but it's already not representative of the act. It's just a way to gauge the act. So this is sort of where one of the situations where you could go like hyper realistic and in depth and introduce a lot more crunch to figure out, this is how you craft the handle, this is how you craft the head, this is how you craft the sword blade. But that's where it can get really annoying to go up very high on the verisimilitude, right?
It becomes too much.
Too much, yeah. So this kind of a situation is where the die can work for you. So in the crafting system that I'm putting out, the complexity of an item is given by a die. There's some examples like, heavy armor is a D10. Heavy armor is a D10. A simple weapon's a D6 or a D4 or something like that. And then at the end of every work period, you roll the die. If you get a high score, if you roll maximum, you make progress. The die shrinks. If you roll a low score, you have to make a check, and if you fail, the die increases. You pay all the cost of the item up front, so you have all the resources to craft the item up front. You don't have to worry about tracking X amount of money. Which, generally speaking, before you start making a thing, you try as best you can to make sure you can actually finish the thing. Now that does introduce a little bit of friction. I can hear some people saying in this case, because what if I want to get started on an item that I know I don't have the resources for right now, but I will by the time I finish. That is where some DM intervention comes into play, because that's something that's relatively easy to arbitrate. You can get started but can only make X amount of progress. The die can't go below X until you finish paying, something like that, right? That's relatively easy to arbitrate. But by paying up front, you eliminate that sort of tracking, and you can focus more on the act of crafting itself. Which, when I hear people talk about characters that craft, I hear them talking more about, they don't want to be accountants, they want to be crafters.
Yeah, exactly.
So it puts the realm of the die roll that, to determine progress in the camp of the crafting and not, the financing.
Hmm.
As for the actual die roll itself, instead of making a skill check, you are assumed to be able to craft the given item if your skill is sufficient. So in this case, using passive checks. If your passive smith's tools is yay high, you can craft with X material.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So you can still make accelerated progress using something else there. The point I was getting to with the verisimilitude of the die itself
Hmm.
is now whenever you're rolling the die is working for you. You're still rolling to see whether or not you make progress, how much progress, if you botched something. But now the onus is on the crafter, the crafting, and less on the financing, the tracking, and by using, shrinking die, like the psionic talent die sort of mechanic, as opposed to a skill check, the roll you make is already determining is the thing you're tracking. You don't have to worry about tracking any other number. That roll symbolizes everything about your crafting progress. And I find that to have a higher degree of verisimilitude than making a check for accounting, because it puts the onus on what the player is actually doing and wants to be doing.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
I don't know if I went off the boat there.
No, not at all. I think, yeah, you definitely answered the question.
Okay.
Yeah, because that definitely puts it in context. And yeah, it's something of an abstract thing to think about. But then when you're thinking at this level of design, I think it definitely helps you as a homebrewer to be able to comprehend this kind of thing.
I'm very, very big on making mechanics that interact directly with player psychology. I don't think of mechanics in a vacuum, because I think you have to understand that there is a person playing the character, and the closer you can get to making the person and the character think the same way, the better the mechanic is. Obviously, huge amount of variance in that, but
Yeah.
I like to believe that there's a happy medium. It's actually part of why I like barbarians so much. Rage as a mechanic is extremely good at this. You can't do intricate tasks. You can't cast spells. It's and you, in order to maintain yourself, to maintain that combat prowess the player wants, you have to act in character with someone that is extremely uncontrollably angry. Pick the nearest enemy. You have to attack them. You have to be in combat. Otherwise, you lose this benefit. The player's interest aligns with the character's personality or their current mood, their action set. When those
Hmm.
options align, you end up with a lot of players. I don't know if this has been your experience, but it's definitely been mine. So a lot of players that play Barbarian really, really like playing Barbarian. And this layer of let me put that put that in a different way. The
Mm-hmm.
players that play Barbarian really like their characters. Cuz there's lots of players that really like playing Wizard. And Wizard's fun. And the Wizard has its own really good mechanic for this. But say the act of casting a spell, or no, maybe this is the wrong way to put it. I'm not going to give a counter example right now because I'm not thinking of a good one.
That's okay.
But the players that play Barbarian really seem to like their characters. And this is something I've noticed pretty widespread to people who play Barbarian, and I'm sitting there why is that? And I'm fairly convinced that Barbarian's features, one, give that power fantasy that's very appealing, but then put the player in this role where the mechanics they have to fulfill to play the class quote unquote correctly play into their characters in a way that's really, really satisfying and really puts them in their shoes. When that alignment makes Barbarian fun to people who want that kind of character. The flip side is Barbarian is very specific. So, you know, there's lots of people who want to you make Barbarian subclasses that are like, you are the calm Barbarian. I personally hate that. But that sort of a thing is indicative of a narrow concept. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. But there's an extent. The narrower your concept, the less it appeals and the more specific it gets, and you end up with something super, super niche. It has to be if you're in that Goldilocks zone of just broad enough, you end up with Barbarian. This class that, by all intentions, is pretty simple, but you have a ton of variation within the character types. But even though the mechanics are relatively similar, you know, swing axe, hit them, do more damage, the characters, the players really like their characters, and they can put out a wide variety of character types with these same mechanics and feel satisfied with it. And I think that phenomenon is tied directly to what I'm talking about in terms of aligning the character personality, the character role play, and what the player actually wants to do.
Interesting.
To put it a different way, more succinct perhaps, when the mechanic encourages the player to act like their character, they like their character more.
Okay, yeah.
I think that would be the succinct way to put that.
Like in the same manner as the rogue being encouraged to use particular actions by making them a bonus action and easier to perform every round.
So in this case, rogue does have a little bit of friction in terms of all the character concept people want to put in it. But like the idea being, if you're like playing the scoundrel that hides and sneaks and sneak attacks, rogue is very good at encouraging that. Rogue is all about looking at your surroundings, finding an advantageous position and exploiting it. Because otherwise, you're weak.
Yeah, like it wants you to be dipping in and out of melee and retreating to a advantageous spot and making the most of your terrain, like you say.
Yeah. So like that, encouraging that layer of... So if you're playing the hidey scoundrel rogue, that matters a lot. But, you know, if this is where there's a little bit of friction, because if you're trying to play, say, like the bouncer thug rogue, you're a bit out of luck, at least until 3rd level, and a subclass gives you a way to work with that. Because then outside of that, you have to rely on being within 5 feet of someone else, which, you know, you're extremely likely that someone is going to be within 5 feet of someone else, but it's like that introduces friction with certain character concepts, right? And that's, if you look at the variant class features Unearthed Arcana, they very much recognize that. Wizards of the Coast does, rather. Because you'll see they introduced that aim action. Aim is not really better than hiding. It's worse than hiding, realistically speaking. But it means it introduces a way to play rogue that aligns with certain character concepts more. Granted, now there is the matter of effectiveness affecting how a player plays the game, and so making a strictly inferior option that allows for this kind of a thing doesn't always work out, because a player may be too tempted to still use the other option that doesn't fit as well because it's strictly better. But it shows the awareness is there. And definitely some people are going to have been using that aim option and are loving it because it enables that. It enables that coherence between player and character.
Yeah, so I think I'm getting what you're saying now, yeah, because this falls back into something we were just talking about with Mike about tropes as mechanics. Because like something that the Apocalypse system does really well is that you get to play as an archetype of a character, and then all of your actions are based on the tropes of that archetype. And I feel that's like what we're kind of talking about here. Like if you're playing the barbarian, the trope is that you get angry and you do more damage, and that is directly tied into the mechanics.
Yeah, essentially correct. So this is what I meant. What I meant before we started. The every action you give the player is representing some sort of imagery. It's an image. Usually that image is some sort of trope, like Sun Soul Monk and like the ki blasts from Dragon Ball Z. That's representing that sort of trope. You really want the player to feel like they're doing that thing in their head. Yeah, so this is where I tend to butt heads with other designers. Well, some other designers. I think that representing a unique trope with a generic mechanic is bad. It's so like, for example, right now in D&D, the representation of ki is a short rest pool of points, or a short rest recharge pool of points. I actually think this suits Monk pretty well, because I'm considering the psychology of the player. So what does it mean to have a short rest based resource? It means that the player playing the monk is going to be calling for short rests more often. Now, in character, what does that translate to? The type of characters you'd expect from a monk would be, say, the ones that are espouting wisdom. Let's be patient. Let's take the cautious route. The monk having mechanics that encourage them taking short rests, encourage their characters encourage them in character to advise caution, advise resting, advise taking your pace. And that's really cool. That wisdom that plays into their thematics plays into how they role play. That's just really cool to me. Now, there are drawbacks to that in how 5e has handled short rests. But, assuming the 1 or 2 short rests per day that 5e wants, that's really, really cool. Now, if you were to take another class and give them a short rest pool of points, a short rest recharge pool of points, I think you're going to be doing that class a disfavor, because you are taking a mechanic that already exists in the system and has implications within the system, and you are necessarily going to be conflating the two in the player's mind. That mechanic already exists. There is already an association with it. And let's say the classes had come out at the same time even. Whichever class that individual player likes more, that becomes the basis with which the other one is compared. So you're no longer representing a unique image. You are not giving the player a unique way to realize the trope that they want to realize, or the character type they want to realize. And that uniqueness is important, because there are some situations where this doesn't necessarily apply, but it's like it means the mechanic that would represent that trope the best, obviously subjective, but is going to have different psychology associated with it. You're going to want to encourage the player to think differently to realize that trope than if you were realizing a different trope. Using the same mechanic for both, while it would increase simplicity, does a disservice to whichever mechanic comes second.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
Because this is actually why I vehemently dislike spell slot psionics. By you making spell slots, by making psionics that use spell slots, you end up with this situation where now psionics has become spell casting. Yeah, you can flavor it differently, but the way you think about psionics and spell casting is now essentially the same. Sure, there might be a situation where you can't counterspell a psionic ability because there's no material or no components or yada yada. That's very nitty gritty and rare that it actually comes up. People like to talk about counterspell because it's fun, but it's extremely rare that it actually comes up unless the player is actively looking to counterspell.
Yeah, I mean, very few of the creatures in the monster manual even have spellcasting.
And if most of the ones that do have innate spellcasting, which doesn't really gel with counterspell too often. Right, so that difference in that necessary difference in psychology necessary to realize different tropes, to me, makes it evident that the best way to realize a given trope is with a unique mechanical representation. Now, some tropes are very, very similar. You can't get around that. But there are a lot of tropes with a lot of reach. And so when I see something like, a Way of Pugilism monk, I cry a little inside. When I see something like a Zen barbarian, I cry a little inside. Because there are better ways to go about it. There simply are. And that's also why I tend to dislike, classes that have short rest point systems or invocation systems or things like that. Because if the character concept you're trying to realize is truly worthy of its own class, and this is another way I think about it, worthiness of a concept to be a class, but if it's truly worthy of its own class, it should be worthy of its own mechanic.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we'd had this conversation maybe even a month ago, I would probably be feeling like there's some reason he's wrong. But having come to this understanding of game design in role-playing games being represented through tropes and archetypes, and the way that we're now discussing it on those terms, it makes so much more sense to me what you're saying.
I don't actually know how I learned any of this. I'll be real with you. I think I just kind of pieced it together over time as I made a thing, and I hated it, and I didn't know why. So I just kept asking myself, why do I hate this? A lot of it just comes from the fact that I looked at some of the design documents that 5th edition put out, and I listened to some of the interviews with Mike Merles and Jeremy Crawford, and they're like, story comes first, story comes first, story comes first. And coming from 3.5, that was bizarre to me. It's like, what do you mean story comes first? What's wrong with a feat that gives you +1 AC? And then I realized, because who cares about the +1 AC? People don't care. Well, some people care about the +1 AC, but generally when you're making a character and not building a when you're building a character and not a character sheet, you don't care about what the +1 is. You don't care about the +1. You care about what it represents. You care about mechanically representing that part of your character you think is cool.
Absolutely.
And it's extraordinarily boring when the part of your character you think is cool is represented by something that doesn't necessarily do the concept justice. And this is where what I told you about before when it comes to reflavoring and its limits comes in. Because different people have different tolerances for reflavoring and whether or not a mechanic is quote-unquote good enough for them to enjoy a thing. I've encountered many people that are like, I just reflavor sorcerers into scions and it's fine for me. And, that's fantastic. That means they get to have that fun without more work or waiting, and that's beautiful. I couldn't do that. If you tell me to play a scion as a sorcerer, I would be miserable playing that character because those mechanics that make up Sorcerer don't encourage me to play in the way the tropes associated with Scion play out.
100%. Yeah. Like, if you've ever seen the renewed Scion, is that Lahinet? I'm pretty sure it was by him. But the way he's approached it is, in my mind, like, pretty much spot on to what I would want in it. Like, it does exactly what you're saying with, like, encapsulating unique tropes, and really representing them in a way that's separate from all the others. I think he uses a variation of like spell points as the base and kind of works out from there.
Is this the one that's 78 pages long?
I believe so. Because, yeah, it has entirely new spell lists.
It replaces spell casting, essentially, yeah. And so this is closer to what I meant, but this is very much like I want to play a 3.5 Scion. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to play a 3.5 Scion, there's basically no better option available to you. That was Entrench or Devilkin, depending on his U/Devilkin. That's Devil. There's Devikyn. Devikyn.
Yes, that's right. It was his one. Yeah, this is like a very 3.5 design.
Yeah, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that if that's what you're into. But this is the kind of Scion that, while I would enjoy playing, is the kind of thing that made Psionics not enjoyed by a wide variety of people. In 3.5 and other editions, a lot of Psionics was kind of kicked down because it was like, this is an entirely new subsystem, as large as as large as spellcasting in a game that is already kind of complicated, and there seems like there's some broken stuff in here, and I don't want to deal with it. The same problem that actually got Mystic.
Yeah.
There's 40 pages. I don't care. Which is a shame because like I said, I like modularity. But I also understand that there has to be limits. You know, you're not going to drop this in the average table, 40 pages or the 70 pages, and the average person is going to be like, yeah, I'll read through this and see if I like it or not. They're going to be like, why are you doing this to me?
And it's pretty worth clarifying for the audience that aren't aware, like within the homebrew community especially, there is a very, very, very intense amount of debate as to how the Scion should be approached.
So, yeah, it is very, very intense. The extremes are essentially make an entirely new subsystem. The Scion uses that exclusively, and then just play Sorcerer. So I actually ended up making my own Scion as well. And it was essentially, I've done this a couple of times already where I make an entire class out of pure rage and spite. I read the Unearthed Arcana with the Psionic talent die, and the mechanic itself is neat. I like the mechanic of it a lot. I think it fits Psionics horribly. You have this trope that's associated with self-discipline, and there's some amount of uncontrollable powers in that trope as well. But we've conflated self-discipline, control, this mastery of the self and the world around you through intellect, and that uncontrollability, wrapped it into a single mechanic and called it good. So now, if you want to play that practiced, disciplined Scion, you have to deal with the fact that you don't really have control over your power, and that sucks.
Like the Wilder versus the Cerebromancer.
Essentially, yes. Because, like, when I imagine a Scion, I don't think of a guy that... I don't think of a person that, when they manifest a power, it's, like, completely out of their control, how strong it is, and whether or not it burns them out. So, like, on specific classes, that actually seems really fun. On a Scion, like a intelligence Scion, that is bewildering to me. especially on Psionic Knight, there is this massive juxtaposition where like you've trained for years to master this psionic power, and then you don't even have control of how much damage you can reduce. You just can blow through your reserves of psionic powers without any say, and without your say being in the matter at all. Or you say that you're in the or you can flavor it as you're in control and you meant to do that, and then it sometimes is just strictly suboptimal because it's like, a goblin hit me for like 3 hit points, let me reduce it. 12. Okay, I guess I burned myself out on a goblin small attack because I'm dumb. I overestimated it. You know, my like 16 intelligence fighter just didn't know. That seems kind of dumb to me. That's see where that cohesion that I'm talking about just vanishes.
And I wonder if like the largest problem with the Scion is that in the West, at least, I don't think the tropes of the Scion are very clear because they come from so many different forms of pop culture. Like on one end, you've got like Stephen King's Carrie and Scanners, maybe, where you've got like people who are kind of out of control with like their telekinetic powers or whatever. And then at the other end, you've got like the more anime style ESP characters where I don't understand that very closely, but my impression is that they're very wise, controlled characters that have like this deep understanding and greater sort of mental, almost like a cross between a wizard and a monk.
Yeah, that is a very good way to put it. That is generally how I put it. So I don't necessarily think it's a split between East and West, though. Because, like, if we look at the most prominent source of, like, psionics in popular media, it's X-Men.
Oh, shit, yeah.
In X-Men, you have both. You have your Jean Grey?
Jean Grey, I think.
This uncontrollable telekinetic, pyrokinetic demigoddess, and you have Professor Xavier. You have both.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're both reasonable tropes to want to fulfill, and they're both possible to fulfill, but they are at odds with each other. You don't fulfill them in the same chassis unless you have a good way to modify the chassis, like with a first level subclass, for instance.
Yeah, like both of those things would have to be represented through subclasses.
Not necessarily. Like Wild Magic Sorcerer, normal Sorcerer is pretty in control of their powers, but Wild Magic introduces a wrench into it. You can do the same thing with like a psionic character and a psionic class, theoretically.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the question is whether or not that's a good idea to do. I don't know. I personally would think that something like the Wilder, which is sort of where Jean Grey is at, would fit better on a charisma-based class, which, like the Sorcerer, I hate that it's, a spellcaster, but in this case where it's innate powers and you don't necessarily have definite control, it's one of those cases where you can sort of slink by. Now, I mentioned that I hate spellcasting as a representation of psionics, and I also mentioned that I hate not giving unique tropes unique mechanics. And that is at odds with... There are statements that are at odds with each other, right? Because if you do an entire subsystem to represent psionics, you're in the 70-page monster where realistically only people that play 3.5 or Pathfinder or so on are going to delve into that. Or people that would be predisposed to liking those games to begin with.
Yeah, it almost seems like the logical approach is to have your own psionic system separate from spellcasting and then have the maybe even different base classes that utilize it, which, as you say, would be massive.
Yes and no. One, I think introducing the subsystem into existing classes as a representation of Scion doesn't work. Because So I am starting from the standpoint that psionics is separate from spellcasting necessarily. It is an entirely different power source. We'll notice that a lot of the classes in the player's handbook are separated into classes based on what fuels their powers. Psionics is a form of magic, but it is not spellcasting. Now, this is where things get finicky as well, because, like, if you look at a Mind Flayer, and this has happened in multiple editions, the Mind Flayer's psionics is represented with spellcasting, and then later down the line they release a psionic Mind Flayer.
Yep.
I think that psionics in previous editions got off wrong because they end up recycling a lot of material. There are, let's say psionic dimension door, right? It's dimension door, but for scions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because at that point they'd made it necessary to separate the two because one can't interact with the other. So you need to be able to represent the same kind of functionality.
In 3.5, they could interact with each other. You could make it so they didn't, but the default rule was that you could dispel psionics.
Was that the default?
Yes, it was. At least in the Forgotten Realms. I don't know how Athos does it.
Okay.
But like in 3.5, it most certainly was. Considering the default setting, at least for a large portion of it, was the Forgotten Realms. So there was a little bit of that trying to represent the uniqueness of psionic powers. But a lot of the things you'd expect a scion to be able to do were replicable by spellcasting. So they just made their system and then shoved spellcasting in it. Or shoved some spellcasting effects in it. Psionic charm person, psionic hold monster, psionic blah 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 blah. And that's a problem. Because you're introducing additional overhead. Especially when things had similar, like psionic invisibility functioned differently from spellcasting invisibility, but psionic dimension door basically just read as dimension door.
Yeah.
So the way I reconciled it is to introduce this psionic subsystem, but have spellcasting as a supplementary feature to that subsystem so that you do not need to overwrite. So instead of having the 78-page, monster, you would have, psionic spells like your Mind Flayer.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would have psionic disciplines to represent those tasks that are uniquely psionic. Obviously, just giving features that say they're psionic doesn't really give that uniqueness, that representation, that cohesion between player and character that I was talking about. As a demonstration of how I think, right? So 3.5. In 3.5, you couldn't upcast spells. That wasn't really a thing.
No.
You could cast them using a higher level. You could prepare them using a higher level spell slot, and you would get the benefit of it being. I believe it increased the difficulty class, the DC to pass the spell, but I don't recall. But essentially, there was a you would get like a minor benefit, but like say the damage of the spell, amount of people it targets, none of that was affected. It was actually in psionics where that mechanic first showed up. 3.5 psionics gave you the ability to invest more of your psi points, your resource, in order to increase the power of the spell.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was incredibly powerful by comparison.
It was incredibly powerful. Psionics in 3.5 was, in many ways, because of point casting and because of augmentation, considered stronger than spell casting. And that's part of why a lot of people hated it in 3.5. It's because spell casting was already kind of borked in 3.5.
Though I think I do remember having to qualify a lot of the time that you were limited by your discipline level or whatever it was, like you're basically your class level. you couldn't spend more points than that, I think.
Yeah, you were limited by your scion, your manifesting level.
That's the one.
And that's definitely true, but also, like, trying to recall what exactly the point conversion was, because man, I do not remember. Oh right, no, because the point cost was actually listed in each individual psionic power. It wasn't standardized.
Yeah.
Though most of them did the same sort of thing, like they had the similar costs. They weren't actually the same cost for any given psionic power level.
Yeah.
So like, let me see if I can find one here. For people that are curious, there are a decent amount of these 3.5 psionic powers in the 3.5 SRD. Recommend looking it up if you're interested in the abominations we're talking about.
Because there was the Complete Psionic and the Expanded Psionic Handbook, which replaced a lot of the content from Complete Psionic, but not completely.
Yeah. So, yeah, a level 9 psionic power costs 17 power points, which, so when you get them, it's, you're stuck at 17, because you would get the 9th level ones at 17th level, if I recall correctly. But like a second level power, you could, so if you say, let me see if I can find a simple one here. Energy push. It costs 3 power points to put out, and then for every power point above 3 that you spent on it, the damage the damage would go up, something like that.
Yeah.
And that was entirely new to 3.5. Beforehand, your fireball scaled based on your total caster level, and then what spell slot you cast it with didn't really matter as much.
Yeah, it was just a fixed increase, kind of like we have now with cantrips.
Exactly, like with cantrips. So Psionics introduced upcasting, which clearly there was a resonance there because they took the mechanic and put it in spellcasting in 5th edition after the death of Mistra for the 3rd time. Death, but not really death, kind of death. The
a Marvel death.
A Marvel death. A Dragon Ball Z death.
Yeah.
Though, no, it's probably closer to a Marvel one because they died but not really died, as opposed to really dying and just coming back.
That's fair.
So, the point I was making before is when I started developing the psionic mechanic, I was looking at that. What separated the psionics from the spellcasting was augmentation.
That was
this enhanced control over your power. Spellcasting is a discrete effect. Psionics, you could manipulate more on the fly. And so this is actually where a lot of the, psionic should just be a sorcerer debate comes from. It's like, all right, they can manipulate their stuff on the fly. That's meta magic, right? This is where I disagree. So let's go back to the X-Man example, right?
Sure.
You look at Professor X, which I use Professor X for the model of a lot of psionic stuff because he is like the telepath, the telekinetic. You think about him, and like Magneto are the ones you think about when you think of those characters a lot of the time, just because of just how well known they are.
Yeah, they're really good examples to point to that people are going to be familiar with.
Exactly. So they don't necessarily have a ton of powers. They have this, 1 or 2 or 3 powers that they really know how to use in different ways. Professor X, he can force choke people, but that's not a different power. He's just using the power he already has in a new way. He's augmenting it. He's shifting it. He has this control, this mastery over this power that a spellcaster really doesn't have. They can develop new spells to emulate it, but that free-form ability to take, telepathy, I'm going to read your mind, I'm going to enhance how much pain you feel because I'm in your head. That doesn't happen in spellcasting unless you make this like massive spell, but that's still this weird discrete effect.
Yeah, spellcasting isn't dynamic like that.
So my point is, when I was developing my psionic spells, my psionic system, I made psionic disciplines. These disciplines have these at-will options. They're at-will powers that are uniquely psionic. There are your psionic cantrip in a sense, but they're not necessarily, they don't scale like cantrips. They're just the at-will option.
Mm-hmm.
And you get relatively few of them. I believe you get 4 total. And each one has 2 at-will options, so that translates to 8 at-will options. And that's exactly, I wanted to put an emphasis on the at-will options because of the way the actual mechanic works. Because you get like a couple spells to augment, to fill in the holes between your disciplines. I think, yeah, like 10, 11, 12, 13, less than Warlock, around like Ranger level, Ranger amounts of spells. They cast using points. And so why did I use points? It's because points are fluid. When you are using spell casting and you have these slots, there is a separation between 4th and 5th level. And that's super cool when you're talking about discrete effects, because now you are talking about this controlling this outside force, this magical force that's strange. It's beyond you, right? You're just tapping into it in different ways. You are manipulating the weave or, whatever magic system in a certain way to get a discrete effect. It's like a chemical reaction.
Yeah, you're running like programs on a computer. Like whenever you hit that button, it runs the same routine every time.
Exactly. Points are not like that. When you're doing something big, you have to consider that it's going to affect your ability to do something small, and vice versa. This has a definite psychological impact on how the player uses their resource, because you'll notice that some of the stuff on some of the feedback on Mystic was like, I ran out of points too fast. That's in no small part because saying I have 1 5th level spell slot left and I have 60 points left. That's a very large difference in how you think about your power.
Absolutely.
Because now you're conservative with your 5th level spell slot, but no, I'm still at 60 points. I have plenty. You're tempted to play a little more reckless, which I think you'll find that in inexperienced scions is a bit of a trope.
Yeah, like they exhaust themselves very quickly.
Now, you don't want to be punished too heavily for that, because then it just makes you feel bad for using your powers. This is where having a decent amount of at-will powers comes into play to mitigate some of that. You still feel like you're doing your cool psionic things, because you use the points to augment your psionics, your at-will psionic powers. So let's give an example here. Let's go with one of the more immediately recognizable ones, telekinesis.
Mm-hmm.
What are the basic building blocks of telekinesis? You either you move a thing or you move a creature. Yeah, you're moving things. Those things can either be living or non-living, and I split them up accordingly. So by default, you just have the ability to move things. How heavy they are depends on your level, and all this sort of minute stuff doesn't matter for the overall point, right? But now you say, no, I want to learn an augmentation that enhances my ability to manipulate objects. All right, now I can spend psi points to make it so I can lift heavier things, or make it so I can lift heavier things, or to increase the amount of things I can lift. All right. Now I can, or maybe I can do both. I can lift 2 heavier things instead of one really heavy thing or two not heavy things. And the feature itself is only about a pair, it's smaller than your average spell. But the openness with which you can use it, because it's riding this base feature, is significantly more palpable. Because now you're not limited to this discrete effect. You have control in where the power in that effect manifests. And now suddenly the player is thinking about how they can chain together these cool powers that they have this enhanced control of to get more benefit out of it. The easiest thing, so at 5th level, they get the ability to use 2 of these basic features a turn. Because they don't scale, you can afford to do that, right? You're not giving this caster analog martial DPS because they're still, your base telekinesis is still doing only 1d8 or whatever.
Sure.
So it's fine for you to be able to do it twice, because now you're just doing 2d8. That's exactly what a caster does at 5th level. Though you have this enhanced utility to it, since you can do it twice. All right. Let me grapple this. So let me lift this guy off the ground and then grapple him there. Suddenly you're Darth Vader. And it's the way to think about it, because spellcasting in 5th edition actually just can't do this. The way concentration works makes it so you can't do that kind of a thing. Like
Sure.
you can cast levitate on an enemy, I think, right? And that would restrain it. But you can't force choke it and restrain it. That's just not possible.
Exactly.
So you have a unique representation that makes the player think about this enhanced control they have, because they can physically, or they can actually do more things with it. A degree of freedom that doesn't exist in spellcasting manifests here, but you don't have all the cumbersome reprinting of spell effects, because spells are just a part of the design. They are a backup. And they fill in the holes that, say, telekinesis as the discipline can't fill. Or let's say this one's actually a little more poignant. The teleportation discipline lets you do all sorts of cool teleportation things, but it can't replicate Dimension Door. And you really think that a character dedicated to teleportation should be able to replicate Dimension Door. So they can use, their limited spell count to get Dimension Door. And now the character doesn't feel like it's missing something, and it still has this unique psionic flair to it. And the whole class is still only 12 pages. Because it uses spellcasting to an extent.
Yeah, so you've got like the half-casting element to it, but the psionics is represented through the class abilities being just more open and versatile.
Yeah, so it is more. It does scale like a full caster, to be clear, but yeah.
That's fantastic.
So that was a very long tangent to give an example of how I think when designing a thing.
No, but that's a really good walkthrough, I think. It's definitely interesting to be able to see your technique in practice.
It's just after 8 classes, you begin to have to develop a philosophy about it. Otherwise, you're going to go insane.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
You figure out what works for you and what doesn't. Because making things that don't work for you, after I still have a class that I'm on the 20th revision of that I'm not happy with.
Which one is that?
It's a port of the Totemist from 3.5 Incarnum. Magic of Incarnum.
Yes. I think you've talked to me about this before.
Yeah, it is the bane of my existence. Because I think Incarnum is so cool, but it's just so extra in its mechanics that paring it down but keeping what makes it cool is so difficult. But it is a burden I have accepted. I'm going to do it eventually, but that's not today.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a massive fan of the 3.5 Tome of Magic with True Naming and Shadowmancy.
The concept of true naming is awesome. The mechanic
Uh,
of true naming was questionable.
you mean doing it as a skill check?
Yeah, yeah. So for those not aware, true naming was a casting system where in order to cast a spell, you needed to succeed on a skill check. If you didn't, you just didn't cast the spell and your action was wasted.
Mm-hmm. And every time you succeed, the difficulty goes up.
Yep, it was. Ooh, it was. And that's the best part about it. It was. It isn't still.
Yeah, I mean, that whole book was really poorly play tested, maybe not even at all.
But it
And
did give us Warlock, and that's basically the only thing it gave us.
yeah, well, that and dreams. Dreams of really cool characters that could exist if things just worked.
It was very strange, actually. The mechanics for like I've read like over or around 50 Forgotten Realms novels at this point.
Oh, wow.
And shadow magic is not described anywhere like what the book put out. Shadow magic is just described as spellcasting in the Forgotten Realms, but with an emphasis on illusion and necromancy and a severe, it was either inability or handicap to evocation spells. To the point where shadow adepts developed an illusion spell that made targets think they were getting hit by an evocation spell.
Yeah, that's right. Because yeah, shadow, like a lot of shadow magic. In I think you in the Tome, either in the lore or the Tome of Magic, I can't remember. A lot of their magic is based around like making illusions real, out of like shadow stuff or whatever it is.
Yeah, there's Shadowfell, whatnots, and so on. They weren't called spells, though. They were called mysteries.
That's right.
Oh, God, I hate it so much. Warlock in 3.5 was a strange beast, too. They were all at-will powers.
Yeah. Like, it was basically the cantrip class.
Cantrip class? Yeah, no, in a sense, but it wasn't really cantrip. They had their Eldritch Blast, which scaled like a rogue sneak attack, but it was really like at-will spells that did it for them. Like they could cast Charm Person at will. Which sounds more broken, but it was limited to 1 per target. You could feasibly fit that on 5e Warlock. Probably as a higher level thing, but you could do it.
Well, even the 5e Warlock is a strange thing.
Oh yeah, I also reworked the Warlock. Really, it's just the fact. I think that they just didn't know. I think what Wizards of the Coast wanted Warlock to be is not what people wanted out of Warlock mechanically. I think Pact boons are sincerely one of the best ideas that is in 5th edition. You remember how I was talking about modularity and how bigger significant choices was a major advantage of 5th edition, but it was not quite modular enough? Pact boons are like that sweet spot. They define how you play for the rest of the game, and they're subclass agnostic, so you have this really cool way to differentiate Warlock of X patron from Warlock of Y patron, or for 2 Warlocks of X patron, rather.
Yeah.
The problem is, of course, that Pact boons are less consequential than they ought to be. Like, people pick Pact of the Blade, and they're like, I'm going to be the Gish Warlock. People pick Pact of the Tome, and they're like, I'm going to be the casting Warlock. But that's not really how it plays out, because the boons are so weirdly minor.
Yeah.
There is a decent amount you can do with that. Like, I'm the ritual casting Warlock now, and all this kind of stuff. But it's sincerely not as impactful as it could be. And I think it's not as impactful as people want it to be. Judging from the fact that Warlock is pretty popular, but still has a relatively low satisfaction rating, as per the Wizards of the Coast surveys.
Yeah. Because it feels very much like you're picking almost like a second subclass, right? But really you're just picking like, yeah, it feels like picking Battlemaster maneuvers in terms of how significant effect it has on you.
See, that's sort of just spellcasting in terms of how Battlemaster does it. Fighting style is a much better approximation of what I mean at a much lower level, much lower power level.
Okay.
So, like, fighting style is a feature that you get that is absent your subclass that defines how you play for the rest of the game, really. It is a lot more minor on fighter, just on account of the fact that, well, it's a plus X. It's not. They're strong. They're just not necessarily. They're not intended to carry the same amount of weight, or rather, almost. They were intended to carry the same amount of weight, but the way players received Pact boons was that it was supposed to have more weight. And I tend to agree with that. I think it was a missed opportunity. I think Pact of the Blade doesn't compete with Eldritch Blast, not because of some weird design oversight. I think it does it because they expected it to be a backup weapon. I don't think they intended it to be your go-to. But players read that and they're like, cool, I can be like a Hell Knight. No, I'm like, you really can't. Like, you can if you finagle it, but you really can't. Like, there are builds and whatnot, but realistically, you shouldn't expect your player to have to make the thing work.
Yeah.
The problem is, obviously, you need a little bit of buy-in, right? You can't, I'm a 13 charisma warlock with 18 intelligence. Why aren't I effective? You have to give some leeway there. But, like, it looks like it's trying to support the Gish. It just isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even when I was talking to Genuine about Warlocks, because he'd made enough of them.
To say the least.
The way that he described the class to me, because I was like, what is a Warlock? He basically said that it's a melee class, like in principle.
It's a martial class in principle.
Exactly, yeah, that's the right word. But it's always come off to me as like a sort of builder caster.
Yeah, in a sense you're correct. It is intended to be the modular caster. And I think as an expression of a concept so broad as having made a pact for power, it is an admirable attempt that fell just shy. I think it lacked a core unifying. It carries a little bit too much 3.5 in it. It lacked a core unifying feature that brought all three of the Pact boons into alignment, into coherence with one another. So Warlock is strange because how do you make a mechanic that represents having made a pact with the patron for power? That is supposed to be Pact magic. And Pact magic is not bad at that. Pact magic is pretty good at that.
Yeah.
Because if you think about what Pact magic actually represents, it's having gained power that you don't have control of, but comes very rapidly. Having 4 fifth level spell slots that come back on a short rest tells me you don't know how to modulate your power because you didn't study that power. You didn't work to get that power. You made a pact to get that power. And they come back really quickly because the source of it is, for the purposes of a 7th level warlock or whatever, practically infinite. It's pretty good at giving that power overwhelming feeling with an asterisk, assuming you're getting short rests. The what it suffers from are tax invocations and the pact boons falling just shy of expectations. What I did was I took a little bit of that power overwhelming and I spread it out a bit. I removed Agonizing Blast and I gave them a 2/3 sneak attack scaling sort of a deal that applies to their cantrips. And it gets pretty... I just gave them that at level 1 to replace Agonizing Blast at level 2, and it gets pretty interesting really fast because now you have this one mechanic in the base class that has Warlock's damage, that lets Warlock's damage scale. That's
Seems
cool.
sensible, yeah.
Now, when you pick Pact of the Tome, getting those additional cantrips matters a lot because now you can do damage and have that utility, Like, if you can pick Vicious Mockery and have it do a respectable amount of damage, you can pick Thorn Whip, and suddenly that's a really good cantrip, right? Because you have this really big long-range pull, and it's doing a lot of damage. You can get the best of both worlds. You don't have to sacrifice as much to get that at-will utility.
Yeah,
Whereas with
absolutely.
current Warlock, you take Thorn Whip and like you use it once every 20 fights to drag someone into a pit or something like that.
Yeah,
It's not
it's super circumstantial.
exactly. Without Eldritch Blast there to basically overcrowd everything, this singular source of damage scaling becomes useful.
Yeah, because like the
Now,
current meta is essentially if you're not using Eldritch Blast every round, you're not optimal damage, right?
or Eldritch Blast or casting a spell, yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing is now that you have this base class feature that allows things to scale, suddenly the invocation that turns your familiar into a battle pet can just say, all right, your familiar can use your warlock sneak attack. Sick. Now it can do that. Your Pact of the Blade, well, it can't keep up with Eldritch Blast. What do we do? Now you can use your warlock sneak attack on your Pact weapon attacks. So Pact of the Blade becomes the highest damage option, sort of by default, on account of the fact that you can add mod to that, but you can't add mod to your cantrips. I also made it scale with charisma, and I think it's fine that it scales with charisma since you're getting it at level 3.
Yeah.
But avoids a lot of the Hexblade problems anyway. But I still actually kept some of the Blade Pact invocation text, and I did that for a specific reason. And that, I think, is you as a warlock, like if you're picking a martial warlock, I think you want to be able to spec into that to like push that further. You actually have the option of not taking both. So like, there's a 5th level and an 11th level for scaling purposes, right?
Yeah.
But you don't actually have to take both. You can take one of the two and you'd be fine. Because the 5th level one increases accuracy as opposed to giving you an additional attack, and the 11th one gives you an additional attack.
Right.
You can just do one or the other. You don't have to do both. It's not necessary for your damage to scale. You can just do one. And then I introduced one that gives you additional armor, like Pact of the Armor, just like from the Unearthed Arcana one. That kind of, or not Pact of the Armor, like an armor invocation, that kind of a thing. But part of the issue with Warlock for me is that just most of the invocations just aren't satisfying. Cast a spell is not a dark secret.
Yeah. It's very like it feels like a lot of it is filler.
Yes. So I removed basically all of the cast a spell invocations, and the ones that reasonably couldn't be put on a short rest timer, like Polymorph and Bestow Curse, because their durations are too long or because the actual effect of the spell would get nutty. I kept them as invocations, and even for some of the at-will ones like Detect Magic or Armor of Shadows that aren't necessarily bad but are just kind of boring, I gave them additional effects. So Armor of Shadows now gives you a bonus to your armor class against opportunity attacks equal to your charisma modifier while you're in dim light or shadow. That instantly makes it feel like you're not just doing what Wizard does every morning.
Yeah.
At least to me. For Polymorph, I made it so as an action you could actually transform. You keep your mental stats like Wild Shape, and you can use your action to shift the shape you're in, keeping the lower of whatever 2 hit points you're shifting into, of course. So you can do some weird like shape-shifting witch stuff. Like some, like you can be a Fey warlock and do some like sort of skinwalker type motif.
Yeah.
But that kind of a thing is what I mean, where this plays into sort of that kind of the verisimilitude thing, just in a different way. Because in this case, I'm just augmenting the mechanic that's already there, but it's to give a unique representation for something that the trope indicates should be unique. An Eldritch Invocation is not just a spell; it's this fragment of dark knowledge that has altered what you do. And like, sure, no one else can technically cast Mage Armor at will, but let's be real. There's not much practicality in being able to do it at will. That's just lip service. It doesn't really feel like you're doing anything different than casting Mage Armor.
Yeah, it lasts 8 hours. Like, how many times are you really going to use it?
Now you have this thing that makes your Mage Armor uniquely warlock, uniquely dark, uniquely fragmented, away from what everyone else can do. And it's the same principle behind subclasses, right? Your subclass is only important because it's not another subclass.
Yeah.
If Fighter just read as champion and had no subclasses, like that differentiation between the two between what kind of fighter you are, doesn't really matter mechanically.
It's very true.
Yeah, the fact that there is a diversity gives meaning to differentiation. So that's a very abstract concept. Wow. I think I'm getting a little too far off the pale right now. Let's reel it back.
Well, I was going to say, it felt like getting a spell as a warlock. Like, you gave up your soul to learn something that a wizard can just spend like an hour figure out. Like, it felt like such a waste of a bargain.
Right? Of course, in the fiction, it's not like that. But the fiction is not meshing with the mechanic. So you got to make the mechanic mesh with the trope. So like when the warlock uses its invocation to cast polymorph, it should feel different. The way they think about it should be different. It should be this thing that wizards can't do because they haven't sold their soul.
Yeah, it should have like that kind of edginess to it.
It's not even edge, right? Celestial warlock's a thing, but edge is kind of baked into the warlock theme.
Oh yeah,
but I
always think of like the cursed version of things when I'm picturing a warlock.
Your old Elric of Melniboné.
Or I was kind of picturing the bad guy from the Doctor Strange movie. He feels very much like a warlock with like the purple cracked eyes and stuff, and like the power from Dormammu.
I'm not really a Doctor Strange guy. I honestly don't know what you're talking about.
That's no worries. Yeah, if you looked at this bad guy, you'd immediately think he was a warlock in D&D. But yeah, I suppose then I'm very interested if you have time, because we're coming up on 2 hours total for the call, but I think we started like maybe 20 minutes in. But if you're running short on time, you can let me know.
Go a little bit further.
I'm curious what your breakdown on the Ranger would be, because it's one of those ones everyone always seems to want to replace it or tinker with it. Like, I don't know exactly where that instinct comes from, or if that's just a trope at this point.
Ranger is a class that is really cool. People love the idea, but the mechanics that it is given are not satisfying because its core central mechanic is not something it actually has any control over. If you look to Paladin, Fighter, so on, you see that their mechanics are things that they do actively. A Paladin smites. It lays on hands. No one looks at Paladin and they're like, divine health though. Smites, or was it the divine sense though? They're cool ribbon, like they're cool ribbons. They add to the flavor a lot. But favorite enemy just doesn't do that. Favorite enemy isn't smite, it's divine sense. But it's divine sense taking the spot of divine smite on Ranger.
Yeah.
So really the problem is just that it's a really cool character concept that just isn't satisfying. To make it satisfying, you generally have to play in a very heavy wilderness campaign, and the DM has to like really work with you. Which, plenty of people have had fun playing Rangers because they don't necessarily care that they don't have a core feature, so on. But I think the reception is relatively clear on what the consensus is. Even if Jeremy Crawford states that, actually there's nothing wrong with Ranger, they're still the ones getting the most unique features and the variant features coming up, right? Clearly there's something going on there.
Yeah, because in 3.5, the Ranger's core feature was that you had a pet. And then
core feature is a strange way to put it. Here's where the problem comes in. Rangers didn't get an animal companion until I think 6th level?
In 3.5?
Yes.
I remember it. I thought it was earlier than that.
Ranger? SRD? Sorry, 4th level. 4th level.
Okay, that's still high though.
Yes, it is. So the thing about Rangers, Druid was the one who actually got Animal Companion at 1st level.
That's right, yeah.
Rangers in 3.5 did have a similar issue. However, they had a combat benefit against their favorite enemy, which honestly doesn't really do much to alleviate the problem of favorite enemy, which is that you have no control over your favorite enemies, and the fact that your favorite enemy is goblins doesn't help you at all if you're not fighting goblins.
Yeah, it's totally up to DM fiat when you become useful.
Rangers in 3.5 had combat styles, which is to say they could acquire feats that had certain prerequisites without having to fulfill those prerequisites. So a ranger could do 2-weapon fighting without needing a lot of dexterity. Because in 3.5, you needed to continuously scale your dexterity up in order to be able to get the progressively higher 2-weapon fighting feats.
Yeah.
So actually one of the niches for Ranger was strength 2-weapon fighting. Because you could ignore all the dex prerequisites and just pump strength for damage. Especially considering that in 3.5, dexterity weapons didn't apply the modifier to damage.
Yeah. That was a huge difference.
It was massive, yeah. And in fact, my group literally never played with that rule because we thought it was stupid. We just allowed dex on attacks and it worked fine. Or dex on damage and it worked fine. Very glad 5th edition cut that out.
Oh yeah, much less, it's another one less thing to have to remember.
It's less nothing to remember and more that it just felt bad. I want to be this cool 2-weapon fighting dude. All right, good luck. You're going to have to split your stats really hard to do anything. And it feels really bad to be a 13 strength, 13 dex fighter. Obviously, it was closer to 15, 13. And you got to remember, in 3.5, you only got one. You got a +1 every time you got an ability score improvement. It wasn't a +2.
That's right, yeah.
So it honestly wasn't fun to make that compromise, which is why I'm glad it's gone.
That totally makes sense.
But really, I just say Ranger needs a core feature that it can work with that actually feels useful in a general case. It needs something to represent the hunter that it is. And there's different ways to go about that. Wizards of the Coast, at least in the Unearthed Arcana, just settled on give it Hunter's Mark. I kind of hate that because it's lazy. It's simple, and simple helps when you're doing variant class mechanics, admittedly. But I hate it. If a player wanted to use it, I wouldn't have an issue with it. It's not like it's busted. It's just concentrationless Hunter's Mark. Okay. So what I do is I make it so your favored terrain gives you a specific benefit that is generally applicable, and your favorite enemy. So you can pick your favorite enemies, and then Hunter Ranger, the subclass Hunter Ranger.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually one of the best representations of favorite enemy that I've seen. That subclass and the way it does, it lets you pick what you're effective against is absolutely beautiful. They're not like super broad. Like, giant killer only works on large creatures. You're not going to always be fighting large creatures.
Sure. But I mean, that's still like a third of the creatures, right?
It's general enough, and it's still specific. And I think that's important, because a ranger is not... A lot of people impose the image on ranger of being this generalist, survivalist character. That's not what they are. At least not if you read the text. You can make them that. It's also perfectly fine to prefer them to be that. But that's not what they are. Rangers are these very specialized hunters. Like, very specialized. That's the reason they're prepared. They're not prepared casters. Lots of people are like, oh, they should be prepared casters. But a prepared caster is a generalist, right? These guys are hyper-focused hunters. I hunt dragons. The problem is figuring out a way to make I hunt dragons bleed over into general usability. I hunt dragons, therefore I am good at killing large things. That's useful. That works with the player, not against them. That tells them, in a fight with a bunch of goblins and an ogre, I'm the guy that's going to charge the ogre. And I'm not a barbarian. I'm not going to like face tank it. I'm going to dance around this guy, and I'm going to kill this ogre. And that's cool. And so my solution would honestly be to just take Hunter Ranger and cannibalize it into the base class.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I fight undead, or put them at the same level as favorite enemy, right? So favorite enemy 1, dragon. All right, I took giant killer. Favorite enemy 2, at 6th level. We've been fighting a lot of zombies. I'm gonna take undead, which means for my second. So now I get like Hunter's Defense. I fight a lot of undead. They come in hordes. I'm gonna take. I forgot what it was called. It was disadvantage on opportunity attacks. I think it's called avoid the horde or avoid the crowd or something like that.
That sounds right.
And obviously, the Hunter Ranger features aren't balanced well against each other. You can make them balanced well against each other. That's easy enough. We're already talking about modifying the thing. Like disadvantage on opportunity attacks is not as good as multi-attack defense. It just isn't. You could make it better. So those guys are solid. The other thing is that Ranger has a lot of its flavor based on stealth, but it doesn't get a mechanic to represent that up until 10th level.
Yeah.
Or 14th if you don't count hide in plain sight. Obviously, not every Ranger is like particularly stealthy. Some guys are just, balls to the wall, and that's fine. But that's part of what the benefit of the Hunter style choices give you. This actually falls straight back into my Pact boon situation. The Hunter things are essentially Pact boons. They're specializations you pick along the way that are not necessarily large, but they define how you play for the rest of the game in interesting ways. That allows for character expression. That allows for the player and the character to act in tandem. The player wants their character to be able to be this guy that charges ogres. I'm not a barbarian, but I want to be this martial character that sees this situation and is going to do I'm going to run straight to that ogre, and I'm going to chop down that ogre, dancing around him like Dante from Devil May Cry. I mean, that might be a little extreme, but like that is currently basically only given in Hunter Ranger, and I think that's probably a shame. As it stands, Ranger's a class that knows what it wants to do, but mechanically represented it in a extremely subpar way.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, yeah.
As opposed to, say, Warlock, which was a class that was mechanically is technically mechanically fine, but the reception between what it was intended to be and what it was is what causes the displeasure with that guy.
That brings us to the end of part 1. Join us next week when we'll be breaking down Warlock class features, monster design, subclasses and more. If you like the sound of Izzy's work and want to check it out, there's a link to his G Drive in the description you can use while he's building his new publishing label. In the meantime, he's happy for people to head over to the Discord and many things, and you can just ask for Izzy there. Of course, last but not least, thank you for making it to the end of the video, and until the next adventure, stay safe.